Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is a little video tutorial for how to adapt my auspicious elections charts to your location depending on where you live in the world each month. So each month, Lisa Scheim and myself put out a set of auspicious electional charts that you can use, which are basically like lucky dates or lucky astrological charts that you can use to start different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So each of these charts is set for a specific day and time. And what I want to show you in this video is how to adapt those charts to your location depending on where you're at in the world, since we get that question kind of a lot each month, and I've been meaning to do a tutorial on it forever. All right, so you can see the charts that I'm talking about if you go to the Astrology Podcast website, where we have a private subscriber only podcast called the Auspicious Elections Podcast, which is available to patrons on the $5 tier through our page on Patreon. But each month we also put out a single auspicious electional chart, which is for free on the monthly forecast episodes. So if you go to the Astrology Podcast website, you scroll down on the September 2020 forecast, you'll see the auspicious astrological date for September that I have picked out there. So the auspicious election for September is set for September 2nd, 2020 at 7 a.m. local time, or slightly just after sunrise. And if you click on the time, it brings up a chart, and it shows you that this is the chart that we've picked out as the most auspicious electional chart that we can find for general purposes for electional astrology in the month of September. So it has 15 degrees of Virgo rising, with Mercury, the ruler of Virgo, at 24 degrees of Virgo in the first house. The sun is at 10 degrees of Virgo, so this is a day chart. It's just slightly after sunrise. And the moon is over at 14 degrees of Pisces in the seventh whole sign house, where it's applying to a sextile with Jupiter. So this chart has already passed. It's already September 6th by the time I'm recording this, but I'm just using this as an example of a recent electional chart that we've used. So this is one chart that we presented this month. There's 4 or 5 other charts that we presented on the private podcast that's just for subscribers. But what I want to show you now is how to adapt this chart to your location, because you'll notice that I have the location set for Denver, Colorado, just after sunrise. But the question that always comes up is, well, what do I do with this if I live in like a different city, like New York or Paris or let's say Tokyo? So I'm going to show you how to adapt this chart to your location, and it's actually much easier than people often think that it is. So I'm going to use, for the purpose of this, the astrological program called Solar Fire, which is the primary astrology program that I use for just casting charts. I realize that most people don't necessarily have software, and I'm going to try to show you how you can use this process, even if you don't necessarily have professional astrology software like this. But you can also use the same process to adapt the charts to your location on free websites such as astro.com or even AstroSeek or other sites like that, which are the 2 other sort of big sites for casting charts at this point in time, where you can cast a free birth chart or free electional chart, which is what we're doing here. All right, so whatever program you use, whether it's SolarFire or some other website or some other astrology program, go in and enter in the birth data from that's given for the electional chart for that month. So in this case, it's September 2nd, 2020 at 7 a.m. local time. So go into your software program, enter the new chart input page to input the chart data, and put September 2nd, 2020, set it for 7 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock a.m., and then in the city, set it for your location. So initially, I'll set it for Denver here, which is my location, and I'll end up with the exact same chart as what I have displayed on the website. So it might be a good idea to use the example chart first and cast that chart for Denver so that you can see the exact positions of all of the placements, especially the degree of the ascendant, because that's going to be your primary reference point, is the reference chart that I gave cast for Denver. So then go back to the data input page and then cast a new chart, set it for the same date. So the date that's given on the reference chart, which is September 2nd, 2020, or whatever electional date that I've given you in the future, then set it for the same exact time. So don't do any time zone conversions or anything like that. Even if you're in a much different time zone than Denver, you're still going to set it for the same time, which is 7 o'clock a.m. or whatever the reference time is in the chart that I've given you in the future. The only thing that you need to change is the city. So let's say that instead of living in Denver, let's say you're living in New York, and that's where you're going to initiate whatever the action is, or you're going to start a new business, or you're going to start a journey, or start writing a book, whatever you need this electional chart for to start something new, set it for the city where that action is going to originate and where you're going to be at that time. So let's say you're in New York, so we set it for New York and we cast the chart. So what we then need to do is we need to compare it to the chart that I had, the reference chart for Denver, and adjust the chart until it's about the same. So one of the things that we're going to notice here initially is that this chart is actually not that much different than the chart that I had set for Denver. So here's the chart with the same time. So September 2nd, 2020, 7 o'clock a.m., set for New York, New York, so New York City. And we see that the ascendant is at 16 degrees of Virgo and the sun is at 10 degrees of Virgo. So in our reference chart, which was set for Denver, if we go back to that, we see that the ascendant is set for 15 degrees of Virgo and the sun is at 10 degrees. So what I want you to do is basically adjust the time in your new location, in the city that you're in this new chart, until the ascendant degree matches the exact degree that I have in the reference chart for Denver. So if I put the ascendant at exactly 15 degrees in the reference chart for Denver, then you need to adjust the time in the chart set for your city until the ascendant matches that exact same degree. So in the chart set for New York, since the ascendant is already at 16 degrees of Virgo at 7 a.m., we know that we don't have to adjust it too much in order to get it at 15 degrees of Virgo. We just need to move the time a little bit earlier, and then it'll switch to 15 Virgo. So let's try going back to the data input page and editing the chart data, and let's move the time to 5 minutes earlier. So let's change it from 7 o'clock in the morning to 6:55 a.m. And then let's recalculate the chart and let's see where the ascendant is at. And here we find the ascendant has fallen back 5 minutes earlier to 15 degrees of Virgo. So that's perfect. And that means that the electional chart and the most important part of the electional chart, which is the degree of the ascendant, exactly matches the reference that I have for Denver. So at that point, you're done, and there's not anything else that you need to do in this electional chart, but you've successfully adapted it to the location of New York. So let's look at some other examples, though, if a person was in a different city. So let's say that a person instead was living in Paris and they wanted to use the exact same election. So basically, repeat the same process. Set the chart for September 2nd, 2020, the date, set it for 7 a.m., which is the reference time, and then just set it for your city, which is Paris. And let's cast the chart and let's see where the ascendant is located. Okay, so here we've got a bit of a problem because we see that the ascendant has moved a bit more dramatically to 7 degrees of Virgo instead of the 15 degrees that's in the reference chart for Denver. So that means we're going to have to adjust the time more than we did for New York in order to make it match the exact rising degree that we're shooting for in the electional chart. So let's go back to our data entry page. Let's edit the chart data for the Paris chart. And one of the things about this chart is the ascendant is too early. In the New York chart, it had moved too late. But here, since the ascendant is at 7 degrees of Virgo, we need to get it to 15, and we need to get this sun above the ascendant to ensure that it's a day chart. Because when the sun reaches the ascendant, that's when sunrise occurs, and the sun rises over the eastern horizon, which is basically what the ascendant is. So we're going to have to move the time from 7 a.m. in this chart to something later. So let's try moving it forward in 10-degree increments, and let's see if that works. Okay, so let's edit the chart. Instead of 7:10 a.m., let's move it forward just 10 minutes to 7:10 a.m., and let's see how far that moves the ascendant from 7 degrees of Virgo, where it was at 7 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so at 7:10, it moves it forward 2 degrees to 9 degrees of Virgo. So that's a little bit of progress, but we're still not quite there. We need to get it to 15 degrees of Virgo. So let's go back and let's edit it again. And let's move it forward this time. Instead of 10 minutes, let's move it forward 15 minutes. So let's move it to 7:25 a.m. Let's see where that puts the ascendant. So by 7:25 a.m., the ascendant is at 12 degrees of Virgo. So that's close, but it's still a little bit short of our target of 15. So let's try moving it forward another 15 minutes. So from 7:25 to 7:40, hit OK. 14 degrees of Virgo, we are so close. Let's move it forward 5 more minutes. So edit, 45. And there we go. So 15 degrees. So now the ascendant set for Paris, in order to replicate the same ascendant that we had for Denver, which is 15 degrees of Virgo, we had to move the chart forward about 45 minutes from our reference time in Denver, which was 7 o'clock a.m. That brings us to 7:45 a.m. in Paris, and that allows us to replicate the electional chart for September. So that's pretty straightforward. It took a little bit more work because we had a much different, further away geographical location, but for the most part, we're able to replicate the electional chart pretty closely. The only other thing we sometimes need to check is make sure that the moon is still roughly in the same location and is applying to the same planets. So things have changed a little bit here because the moon is earlier in Pisces when you move it to Paris. But for the most part, the moon is still applying to that sextile to Jupiter. It's not quite as close as it was in Denver, which is a little bit more auspicious. But as long as the moon is still applying to that positive aspect with Jupiter, the electional chart is still good. Because usually in most of our general purpose electional charts, we're trying to make sure that the moon is well placed and that the ruler of the ascendant is well placed, because those are your two primary, most important significators in any electional chart that you do, no matter what the topic is. All right, so let's do one more example. Let's say that the location is not Denver or New York or Paris, but let's instead set the chart for Tokyo, Japan. So we'll start by entering the reference date and time, which is September 2nd, 2020 for 7 a.m. And then we'll set the location to Tokyo, Japan. And then let's take a look at the chart and see what comes up. All right, so here we see we've run into a bigger problem because at 7 o'clock in the morning on September 2nd in Tokyo, the ascendant is much, much later and it's already moved into early Libra. So what that means is we have to back the chart up considerably, probably at least an hour, in order to get the ascendant back to 15 degrees of Virgo in that location. So we go into our edit dialog, we edit the chart data, we go down to the time, and let's jump back a full hour and let's take it back to 6 a.m. instead of 7 a.m. in Tokyo, and let's see what that does to the chart. So we take it back an hour and it moves it all the way back to 18 degrees of Virgo. So that's really close, but it's not quite at the point that we need it to be. So let's move it back. We've got to move it back 3 more degrees to get it back to 15 degrees of Virgo. So we go back in, edit the data. Let's move it back, 3 degrees? So let's move it back 15 minutes and see how that does. So let's change it to 5:45 a.m. So 15 minutes before 6 a.m., which was our previous chart. And it looks like we've got it. So 5:45 a.m. in Tokyo brings us to 15 degrees of Virgo rising. And that matches then, essentially, for the most part, with some slight differences, the reference chart that we had for Denver for this month. So we do see that the moon is still even earlier in this electional chart than it was in the other cities of Paris and New York. So that's not as good. And that's something that you're going to have to pay attention to in your electional charts, because you want to make sure that the moon is still applying to the same planets. And most of the time, you can adapt the charts to different locations. And for the most part, you're going to be able to get the same rising degree and the same moon in the same sign and applying to the same planets. Now, here, the moon has to apply to the sun through opposition and Uranus before it can get to Jupiter. But as long as it's still in Pisces and applying to Jupiter, that's kind of okay. Now, sometimes you do have to change the date and move the date forward or backwards by a day in order to get the moon in the same aspects. But I don't think that that would work in this case. Let's try moving it forward a day to the same time, but on September 3rd, and see if the moon is still applying to Jupiter or if it's already separating. Yeah, no, it looks like it's already separating. So the moon would be at 18 degrees of Virgo, separating from a sextile with Jupiter at 17 degrees of Capricorn. So that would not necessarily be as auspicious, because we want the moon moving towards the exact aspect with Jupiter rather than separating from it. So let's keep it as September 2nd. And even though the moon has a lot further to travel in order to complete that sextile with Jupiter, as long as it's still applying to it and it's still in the same sign, that should be okay. So that means that we've been able to successfully more or less adapt roughly the same electional chart to Tokyo, Japan for this date. All right, so other things that I should mention here at this point. Sometimes in the electional chart, we focus on getting the exact same rising degree. So pay attention if we tell you that you need to put the ascendant at a specific degree, like we did here with 15 degrees of Virgo. Other times we tell you to pick a specific rising sign and put the ascendant anywhere in that sign, but other times in those instances, we'll tell you to focus instead on the degree of the midheaven, and to make sure that the degree of the midheaven is aspecting some planet in the chart, usually because we're trying to accentuate or trying to mitigate the placement of that planet in the chart by making the midheaven closely configured to it. So just pay attention to whatever our instructions are, because sometimes we'll tell you whether you need to focus on the degree of the ascendant or whether you need to focus on the degree of the midheaven in that particular electional chart that we've recommended for that month. Other than that, the only other thing that I wanted to mention is that this is kind of the hard way to do it in terms of moving the electional charts forward or backwards in these different increments of like 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes or an hour or what have you, and going back into the edit dialog box to change the time each of those times. But actually, if you have professional software like SolarFire, there's an easier way to do that, because they have this animate chart feature, which is this little icon at the top that has a chart, like a green chart, and then a person like running in front of it. And if you click that button while you have a chart selected, it will bring up a new screen which has these controls over on the right. and it allows you to move the chart forward in different increments of seconds, minutes, hours, uh, days, weeks, months, or years. So I usually set it for minutes, and then I set the animation speed for right about here. And then what you can do is you can just click a button in order to move the chart backwards or forwards in time. And you can either do it in single stops, or you can press the button to just keep moving it forwards or backwards until you hit stop. So that makes it super easy, and that's actually how I speed up this process for myself when I'm picking out electional charts for myself or picking out electional charts for other people. Is I'll use the animate feature in SolarFire in order to quickly adjust the time and quickly optimize the chart for a person's location. So that makes things super quick and super easy. And for me, at least, SolarFire or other professional software programs that can animate a chart like that are really necessary in order to speed up the entire process. So obviously, it's not necessary; it's just kind of a bonus of the software. But if you're doing this enough over and over again, sort of saving the time that it saves, allowing you to move the charts forward and backwards, ends up being really worth it. So I'd recommend checking that out. So SolarFire, I did a tutorial on SolarFire and getting used to it, or learning the software recently on my YouTube channel. So you can check out that video. I'll put a link to it at the end of this. If you don't have SolarFire, you can get that from the website, which is alabe.com. And they've given me the promo code AP15, which you can use to get a 15% discount. All right, so I think that's it in terms of this tutorial. So be sure to check out the astrologypodcast.com website for the monthly auspicious electional date, where we'll give you our top electional chart pick for each month as part of the monthly forecast episode. Or be sure to check out the Auspicious Elections podcast through our page on patreon.com, where we give out at least 4 other electional charts, including the top chart. Plus, we throw in a few different bonus charts for different electional dates that we found during the course of the upcoming month, using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more information about that if you just go to theastrologypodcast.com and click on the elections page to find out more information about how to subscribe. All right, I think that's it for this tutorial. So thanks a lot for watching. If you have any questions, please be sure to let me know in the comments section below. If you like this video, of course, please be sure to like it on YouTube and subscribe. And otherwise, I'll see you again next time for other tutorials and podcast episodes in the future. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.